Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Adolfo Garcia-Sastre. He's a professor in the Microbiology department. He's also the director of Global Health and Emerging Pathogens Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. And, according to his background, for 25 years, he's been researching and looking at molecular biology of influenza viruses and other negative strand RNA viruses. So, very accomplished person in the virology field, and I wanted to have him here because this interview is going to be part of the Understanding Viruses book that I'm going to be putting out. So, Adolfo, thanks for coming. How are you doing today?
Okay, I'm doing fine. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll get started on the questions. Let's first start with your background. So, what got you interested in working on viruses in the first place so many years ago?
Well, when I was, I did my college in biology, and then I became interested when I was doing college in biochemistry. And somehow I got into the Department of Biochemistry in Spain, and that's where I did my PhD thesis. And, it was biochemistry, but I was dealing with a protein of a virus. And I did my PhD into the enzymatic activity of a protein of a particular virus, that it was a chicken virus. And that's what interests me. I read more about viruses, and I got fascinated about how simple they are, and despite that, how they're able to reproduce themselves by using the machinery of a cell. And that's how I decided to do my postdoc in virology and came to the United States. I was accepted as a postdoc in a very good lab in Mount Sinai. And then the rest is history. I think part of it is chance and part of it is fascination at the right time, right?
Yeah, definitely. So just briefly, what's your research about at this moment?
Well, now we are doing a lot on COVID-19 just because that's pressing. But in general, the questions that I'm asking in my research are very similar, not necessarily related to COVID-19, which is how viruses are successful, how they are able to take over the host and cause disease, and at the same time transmit to a new host. And is there anything that we can do in order to prevent some of the viruses that we don't have countermeasures for them in terms of potential therapeutics or potential vaccines? And also what we can learn from viruses that will give us tools to understand biology of ourselves, So it's a broad program, but it's mainly focused on virus biology. And virus biology is not so different from biology. It's just that it allows to simplify some things because they have so limited number of genes that they need to utilize resources at the limit. And this allows you to be able to ask questions more easily that you are dealing with a more complex organism that has many genes like the ones that we have. So it's a way to simplify things, to look for answers in more complex organisms, and at the same time understanding the virus biology and see whether we can do something about virus pathogens.
Okay, well, let's get into the questions here then. So, to your knowledge, do all forms of life have viruses? Are there any that don't seem to, or we haven't found yet?
Well, I think this has always been an open question, right? There were some forms of life that they were thought that we didn't know that they have viruses, and later on, some of them they were found to have viruses. So I think viruses, just the way they behave, they are probably part of life. It's part of biology. So even if there are some forms of life that we don't know yet that they have viruses, it's likely that sooner or later we will find them because they are such a fundamental part of biology that it's very difficult to think about systems that they have been able to come out, biological systems that they have been able to come out with a mechanism that prevent completely the possibility of having viruses. So even for some forms of life for which we don't know yet if they have viruses, I think that sooner or later we will find viruses for these forms of life.
Yeah. And so now a question, that I know is tough to answer. It's probably even frowned upon, but are viruses alive? Contingently alive? Are they fully alive? Are they not alive? What's your thought and why?
Well, that's a big question, but it's more like a semantic question, I think, for me. So it's very difficult to define life. So we think about life as an organism that is able to grow, reproduce, and make copies of itself and get new copies again. So reproduce, growth, making copies. Viruses are alive, but life is a great definition. I don't think that there is a line that tells you this is not life and this is life. This is continuous. So you can consider perhaps viruses when they are frozen, they are not reproducing, they are just chemical entities. You can consider them as not alive. By themselves, they will not be able to reproduce. They need to find resources, but that's actually the same thing with almost any form of life that we know. Without resources, we are not able to survive. So I think they are life organisms, but they are between the limit of life and not being alive. And I think the line that separates being alive from not being alive is a gray line. It's not, everything's a continuous. But it's very difficult to say, okay, here, whatever is before this line is not alive, and whatever is after this line is alive. That's the problem that there is with definitions sometimes, when there is a continuous thing that makes very difficult to put the limit where you consider things are alive or they are not alive.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, even with our own species, even when a woman is pregnant and the abortion laws, there's been a debate there, and when is the fetus a living? I'm not going to ask you your philosophy on that, but I'm just pointing it out that there is debate even there. Is conception the first moment of life? Is it when it's a month old, 3 months old, etc.? So I see what you're saying. It's a gray line, and even for our own selves, if someone's in a coma, are they alive? What's death?
Yeah.
What's life? So it is hard
or the human, right? If, let's say that someone gets frozen for 200 years and then gets somehow thawed back and then is alive back. And he was dead during the 200 years that was frozen, or he was alive but barely alive. It's very difficult to say, right? So
it's true.
I think the definitions become murky because it's always a continuous, and then it's very difficult. And even if you think about potential, so you think about something needs to have potential in order to be alive. You think about potential, then viruses are alive. But even a single cell in my body has the potential to become myself also if it's been cloned, right? And then that means that a single cell in my body is a human being. Well, but as the potential is there, but it's tough. It's tough to make a definition when the line is not there and there is a continuous between inanimated things and things that are alive.
Okay. And then why do you think that some viruses, infect and kill, and other ones infect and will stay with the host sometimes for its whole life, and then other ones will infect and actually become integrated into the host's DNA or genetic material?
Well, to me, that's something that has to do with diversity and evolution. So once that you get into a particular line in evolution, it's very difficult to get back. And it's not only about viruses, it's also about everything that has to do with evolutions. Why some animals, they need to kill another animals in order to survive. And some other animals, they just need to eat plants in order to survive. And why you need to even eat plants, where plants that are living organisms, they don't need to eat anything that is alive. They can survive just by having oxygen and sun, because they can make energy out of the sun, right? So it has to do with biology diversity and how the different forms of life have found different ways how to behave. And once that you get into a line of evolution, then you are doomed into the line of evolution. We, for example, we as humans, we cannot be plants. We cannot just go to the sun and then lay down and then get energy through that, right? And why not? In theory, it should be possible, but it's not possible because the way we have evolved, and it's very difficult to go back to a time where you could make the split decision in evolution to go into getting energy just from the sun or getting energy from consuming other things.
Right.
Same thing with
humans, though. Humans, I could be a nice, community family guy, or I could be a killer, and be really antisocial and just attack all my fellow humans and try to kill them. Do you think that viruses are headed in any direction? So if there's one that's virulent and is killing its host, do you think over time there's any pressure or agency that would turn a virus from, that would turn it less pathogenic, that would make it more commensal with its host?
Yeah, so viruses, they don't necessarily, because of evolution, they don't, in theory, want to kill the host, right? Because if a virus kills very rapidly its host, then it will not be able to survive. Viruses need hosts to survive. If they don't have a host, they are not able to survive. This doesn't mean that there cannot be mistakes in evolution where something goes wrong, and then there are viruses that kill the host, and that's bad for the host, that's bad for the virus. But, it's like something that goes wrong, and then either both of them die, hosts and viruses, or the virus disappears, because obviously without the host, the virus will disappear. And if the host remains, but the virus is not there, then the virus disappears, right? So evolution takes care at the end that you get into an equilibrium. The virus, the only thing that wants to do because of the evolution is make copies of itself and being allowed to propagate and make more copies of itself. And for that it's going to need a host. So again, something can go wrong during evolution. The virus can become more lethal. That is, it's not that he can think about. That's not good for me. It's something that may have acquired this property, and that's not good for the host. That's not good for the virus. And at the end, whatever can happen, if things go really wrong, is extinction, both of the hosts and of the virus. And probably this had happened in the past, not with humans, obviously, because if we had been extinct by viruses, we would not be here. But it's probably that some organisms, they have become extinct. And I think extinction is something that is very common with viruses. Probably the type of viruses that were 1,000, 10,000 years ago were already some viruses that we don't even know about, that they have become extinct. Because evolution is very fast for viruses. It's more fast than for other organisms due to their mutational rate that makes them very fast evolving. But very fast evolving means that you can become extinct also very quickly. So I don't think that, I think that there is a lot of viruses, the same thing as other organisms have become extinct, dinosaurs have become extinct, there are many organisms that have become extinct. I think for viruses, there are plenty of them that they have not survived. They become extinct. The only thing is that it's very difficult to find fossil records of viruses, except for very specific viruses, like the retroviruses, that you get a fossil record because they remain into your genome, into the genome of the host. And, most of our genes are made of retroviruses, which are like a fossil record or retroviruses. But that's because retroviruses are able to leave a fossil record, but RNA viruses like this coronavirus that we have now are running around, they are not able to leave a fossil record. If they become extinct, they're gone. And then it's very difficult to find them again.
If you like this podcast, Please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
I've heard like 8 to 10% of a person's DNA is from endogenized retroviruses from the past.
Yeah. So
Well,
these are the
very
ones
good.
that are able to leave a fossil record, right? Because they have established a particular evolutionary strategy that means getting integrated into the host DNA. Not all the viruses do that, but if you get integrated into the host DNA, you are able to leave your presence there, right? Even if you are becoming not functional, still the DNA is left there, and that's like a fossil record. And that's why we know about retroviruses as fossils, but we don't know about RNA viruses. They don't leave the traces like that.
Okay, so another question I had, and because you're looking at COVID, this came to mind. Is there a word for, so let's say with a given virus, the first people that get it, supposedly from its origin, I'll label them as like number one, and then they pass it to someone else and someone else and someone else. So what if I get infected with a virus that's passaged through 19 people? I'm number 19 or 20. How do you think that the virus would change? Is there a name for such a thing? This passaging and the number at which I've come across this virus and gotten it. And what do you think will be the differences in the virus after its passage through a bunch of people?
Well, that's like us also getting kids and kids and kids and kids, right? So our kids are not exactly as ourselves. I think there is more diversity in our kids because the way we reproduce, which is by mixing the genomes of two people, while viruses, they don't mix genomes, they just reproduce themselves, but they have some mutational rate that make them achieving diversity, and not all the mutations are able to survive, but some do, and if they are doing better, they will actually replace the previous viruses that they were around. But it's like thinking about generations. So viruses can change, but they don't necessarily need to change. So it depends of whether the changes that they undergo is small changes, because they cannot change dramatically from one generation to another. The same thing as your kid cannot be essentially completely different to you, because it has at least half of genetic material. So with viruses, the progeny has more than half of the genetic material of the parent. They may have a few mutations, but that's about it. So they cannot change dramatically from one generation to another. They can become indifferent, but during 9-10 passages, it's very difficult that the virus changes a lot, unless it's a virus that started in the beginning as a virus that was not very well adapted and need a few mutations to become adapted. But that's very rare, right? Because most of the viruses, they don't make it, or they have already some possibility that they will make it, and they need only a few changes to be able to make it. If not, it's very difficult to make it,
Well, with bacteria, they seem to pretty readily take certain genes from viruses and incorporate them to gather immunity. Viruses, again, we know they endogenize in some creatures. I wonder if viruses not only use cellular machinery, but they also take some of the genetic material and incorporate it themselves. And in that way, maybe they do evolve.
Yes, that's the case. We know about examples where this had happened. It's not very common because, it's not, especially for complex organisms that are already adapted, then it's very rare that something like that happen. But one thing that has become clear, for example, is that the placenta, the ability to have which is a main characteristic of mammals. Mammals, they give birth through the establishing of a placenta. So for being able to get the placenta, we need a gene that was a gene that came from a retrovirus. And somehow this retrovirus became into our genome, and the gene that was co-opted in evolution to be able to start the possibility to make placentas. So mammals are mammals, and we are what we are, just because there was a retrovirus that we took a gene out of the retrovirus that became integrated into our genome that made possible to make placenta. So that is not the thing that happen every time, but during the time of evolution, these things happen. Basically, viruses, you can think about them like ways how to, not only pathogens, but ways how to interchange genetic material. And every time that an organism exchanges genetic material with another one, probably things goes bananas and is not good. But sometimes a new genetic material comes that is useful, and that happens also in bacteria a lot of times. That viruses are able to transfer genetic material from a bacteria into another bacteria that without this virus this transfer would have not been possible. So again, it's not something that happens often, but during the time of evolution, these things are going to contribute to evolution at the end. And without viruses, we will be very different from what we are.
Yeah, when a virus infects, there seems to be a latency period. Sometimes, hours, days, maybe even weeks before the organism, shows signs of sickness. Why do you think there's this latency period? What's going on, and how is the decision made, or why all of a sudden would, an organism experience sickness when it didn't before, at the initial stages of infection?
Yeah, I think there are two things here. One thing is that in the beginning of an infection, if we are thinking about an infection beginning, there is a few viruses that invade your body, and a few viruses are going to invade a few cells. And if a few cells of an organism are affected, it's not a problem. If the cells change completely their function and they are not doing what they are supposed to do, and they make copies of this virus, that's okay. There are only a few cells. We have so many cells that some of the cells still take over the function. But as the virus starts to reproduce and there are more cells being affected, then you may have an impact on what was the function of the cells that they have before they started to make virus factors. So that's the reason why we don't become sick right away just by being infected. It takes a while till there is a lot of cells being infected when we may have a disease because of the way, because only a few cells, it wouldn't matter for us.
Do you think it's just the number of cells infected, or do you think that, what if there was a quorum sensing?
So that's one. So I say that's one, right? So there are more than one thing on that. So this will be example for COVID-19, for flu viruses that are acute viruses that come in, they reproduce, they get a lot of copies of the cells, they leave because they go to a new host. They're actually being, in general, eliminated from the host where they came, but it doesn't matter because the virus was able to find a new host and then continues reproducing. Now, there are some other viruses that they don't do that. There are some other viruses that they just become, they insert into your genome, like retroviruses, or they become latent for a long time, and they are all the time with you, like herpes viruses. And in general, these viruses become latent. They don't do too much harm. It's said that from time to time, they become reactivated to be able to make copies of the cells and to be able to infect another person. And during this time is where you get disease, because it's the time. So that's a completely different strategy. They are both valid. They will give rise to a organism that will be able to survive, but they're completely different mechanisms of survival. And then finally, there is also the issue about not everybody behaves the same because we are all with different genetic material and different environments. So a lot of the disease that viruses induce in people is not that everybody that gets infected gets the same disease. There is a spectrum of diseases. So even for viruses that cause diseases, there's always a spectrum. And the spectrum is a combination between what the virus is able to do and what is your predisposition and what is your genetic factors and environmental factors that allow them to for you to become sick, or just not even noticing that you are getting infected and you have a virus that reproduces in you, and then you transmit to a new host. So, and that has to do with diversity. It's like life. There are so many different species, so many ways how to survive in this world. So mass diversity, the same thing with viruses. There are viruses that cause disease, there are viruses that don't cause disease, but the disease is never 100% because it's a combination between what the virus is able to do and what are the predisposition, the particular host, because we are not all the same people that will at the end result in disease or not.
Another question I had is, again, I don't know if this is the case, but it seems that the tissues that a virus infects correspond to the mechanism by which it'll go from host to host. So rabies,
Yep.
A dog may bite me and give me rabies, and then I may be inclined to, to salivate like crazy and bite and try to spread the virus that way. But, influenza, why would I get infected by respiratory droplets, let's say, and then my tissues are affected so that I'll spread it the exact same way? Why does there seem to be a correspondence between, again, the infection mechanism, the cells infected, and the mechanism of spread?
Yeah, that has something to do, I think, with that during evolution you get addicted to a particular behavior. And what I mean about that is that there are many strategies how a virus can achieve transmission. But if a virus has learned how to be transmissible by respiratory infections, then it's going to be selected to become more and more efficient in respiratory infections to the point that either it gets really good at doing that or it will become extinct. And that's the same thing with every mechanism of life, right? It's the same question. So the question about asking why a virus infects the brain, like rabies, makes you bite another host, and that's the way you transmit. Why all the viruses like rotaviruses infect the intestine, and then they get transmitted by a fecal route. So they infect new people through feces and aerosols in feces, and especially kids. Why some viruses they are doing by respiratory droplets, why some viruses they do it by mosquitoes. I think it's the same question like why some animals are surviving by eating plants, why some of the viruses, if they would be given plants, they will die, so they need to eat meat like the carnivores. So it's, evolution creates this diversity of behaviors, and then it's very difficult to turn back evolution. It's very difficult that from a lion in millions of years, there will come a cow. The same thing, it's very difficult that from a cow during millions of years, it will become a lion. But the precursors of lion and cows was the same precursor. It's just that they went into different evolutionary lines and became addicted to a particular behavior that was selected for. And thus, many people believe that things in life are very sophisticated, and that means that there is some intelligence around that was able to make this thing. But I think life is not very sophisticated. It's just becoming complex. But there is things in life that cannot happen. You cannot from a lion become a cow in just 100 years. Would never happen. It's impossible. Biology does not allow for that. But with time, maybe a lion gives changed behavior, and then during millions and millions of evolution, maybe a lion gets also rise to an herbivore. But it requires a lot of changes before this happens, and the changes are very gradual. So that's the same thing with viruses. There are a lot of behaviors that they have been acquired during evolution, a lot of diversity because there have been many, many years of evolution. But it's very difficult from a virus like COVID-19, for example, to become suddenly a rabies virus that now gives you a disorder in the brain and is able to transmit through bites. Why? Because it's not so easy. You just have a few genes that you have, and that's what you have. And in order to change these genes to new genes that allows you completely different behavior, it doesn't happen so easily because you need to go through very small number of mutations, which is what it allows evolution. And thus, a small number of mutations is never going to result in a completely drastic change of behavior.
Any examples that jump to mind of bacteria co-opting a viral ability, or a virus co-opting a eukaryotic cell ability, or a eukaryotic cell co-opting a viral ability? The transmission of genetic information and ability and knowledge, from and to viruses. For example, I've heard that bacteria can harness and express viral spike proteins in their membranes to attack and open up other bacteria. Any examples you've seen that are interesting?
Yeah, no, there are many examples like that, but again, they don't come from just suddenly, right? So they have been acquired during years of evolution. Bacteria are able to transmit genetic information through phages. Phages, from time to phages, they normally integrate into bacteria. They integrate the genome, and when they become again active, many times they take a piece not only of their own genome, but a piece of the genome of the bacteria that is close by. And when this results in a selective advantage for the virus, because it goes to a new host and the new host likes the virus, so because it has now coming with a new factor that is good also for the host, then this is going to happen, right? So that's one example. There are viruses that have taken genes from another viruses because they, from time to time, they have, again, if there is a co-infection, you get the potential of exchange of genetic information, and some genetic information becoming now part of a new virus that is being taken from another virus. Most of the instances this happens, this is a disaster. It's not good for the virus to come with the burden to have another viral gene because it's not good. But sometimes, very rarely, this results in a selective advantage. And when this happens, then this virus is selected and then becomes more prevalent than the previous viruses. So this happens all the time during evolution, but it's not something that happened in a few years. That needs thousands and thousands of years to come out with the right event that makes this exchange of genetic information and acquisition of genetic information an advantage for the organism. Either it's a virus that get it from a bacteria or it's a bacteria that get it from a virus.
Yeah, I just didn't know if there's any examples of this that really stick out to you, that are just amazing to you or interesting that you wanted to comment on.
Well, for example, I can tell you about one that is well known. Before COVID-19, there are human coronaviruses, right? And some of the human coronavirus, they have a gene that is a hemagglutinin esterase that allows them to enter more efficiently into cells. And this hemagglutinin esterase is a gene that was probably acquired from influenza C virus. So coronavirus somehow were able to pick up a gene from an influenza C virus. Influenza C is not like influenza A or influenza B. Usually does not cause disease in humans, but it's a virus that is there. And they took this gene from an influenza C virus into their own advantage. And now they have this virus, this gene, and this allows them to be better fit for propagation among humans. They don't cause too much disease. They're causing only the common cold, but it was a gene of a virus that is corona, very different from influenza. That was a coronavirus picking up this gene from an influenza virus and then using it for his own advantage.
Are there any entry methods of either phages or viruses that you find particularly amazing or complicated or sophisticated?
Well, that's where it becomes definition of sophistication, right? So most of the people think that, and even scientists, they think that viruses are very smart because they have come with very smart mechanisms to enter cells, to replicate, etc. Maybe I'm one of the few scientists that believe the opposite. I think viruses are extremely dumb. They are just what they are because that's what they have been evolved to. And even what you think that the virus entry mechanism and replication mechanism is very efficient and very sophisticated, I think is using weaknesses that happen, and just the virus is able to do it. So they look like extremely efficient machines, but actually they are very error-prone. Most of the viruses, even for COVID-19, most of the viruses that are produced, they are non-infectious. So it's just through sheer numbers that viruses achieve success. If they're able to make millions and millions of copies, then some of them will be successful, but many of them, they have a few mutations that make it unsuccessful. But, they waste a lot of energy, but still, they're able to do it, right? So So the mechanisms, they look very sophisticated, but I think is the end of evolution, is due to evolution. And when it looks very sophisticated, when you look at it, it's not so sophisticated when you think about it. If you want to think from scratch how to make the most efficient organism is able to propagate from cell to cell, probably you will choose different mechanisms than the ones that viruses have been able to come up with, if we will know enough, right? So again, I don't think that viruses are smart. I think viruses are very dumb, but they're very efficient, You don't need to be very smart to be efficient.
Are there any examples of, is it always one virus, one infection, one cell, or are there examples where it takes multiple viruses in order to infect a cell and they're acting in some kind of coordinated manner? Has that ever been observed by you or anyone?
Yeah, like all biology, there is a lot of different behaviors, right? I can put you an example. Hepatitis delta. Hepatitis delta virus is a virus that causes hepatitis, but it's a virus that is unable to propagate by itself. It needs another virus to be able to propagate. It needs hepatitis B virus. So people that get co-infection with hepatitis B and hepatitis delta, they usually have a hepatitis, a disease that is worse, but hepatitis delta will not be able to propagate without hepatitis B because it's a parasitic organism for hepatitis B. It requires the machinery of hepatitis B viruses to be able to replicate. Without hepatitis B virus infection, you don't get hepatitis delta viruses. So, like everything in life, there is so much diversity that you can always find examples about organisms that require another organisms to be able to survive.
Do you think that, how in bacteria, they'll form biofilms, and obviously they'll preferentially form a biofilm with their same species or strain, maybe with other strains too. Do you think viruses have species or strains or quasi-species, and do they have a group identity? Do they know, self versus other, even in the context of a cell?
Well, self versus other, so certainly they don't have conscience, right? But the ability to distinguish self versus other has to do with the way they replicate. If they replicate themselves, that's what they think they are self, right? You try to replicate yourself. Sometimes, like I put the example of hepatitis delta, a virus comes with a replication machinery, but is somehow tricked by another virus that doesn't have replication machinery to also replicate this other virus. So you can have always this type of potential tricks that you may get into. But viruses, by definition, because of the machinery that they use to replicate, especially RNA viruses, they have genetic material that is RNA that is not as stable as DNA. It does not have ways how to preserve the ability of the DNA to become stable. So they have a high error prone. And because they make so many copies of themselves, then all the copies are not exactly the same because they are mutations, and that's what is called quasi-species. Now, this helps the virus in a way that if any of these mutations allows them to somehow overcome a particular barrier, then it will be selected more quickly. So evolution in general is more faster in viruses than in other organisms, just because the mutational rate is higher. On the other hand, mutations makes them also, they become with a burden because most of the mutations are deleterious. But again, it's the biology, and it's the biology that the virus has to do, and it's the biology that is being used in evolution to make viruses to be able to evolve, and they evolve more rapidly. But again, they have constraints also. From a virus, you cannot make a plant, or you cannot make a mammal. You can make another virus that is more efficient.
Right.
That's about it.
Yeah, I've heard of a term, drift versus shift, when it comes to viruses, and so I'd like you to answer what that means. But if there are multiple viruses in the local environment around a cell, and many different kinds of viruses could infect it, do you think there's a competition, or is it just luck? Like, oh, this one just got to the cell first. So drift versus shift, and then is there competition to infect the cell?
Well, they are both things, right? Some particular quasi-species will be able to help one another. Just some that they compete for the same thing, and that's part of life also. Many viruses, for example, make the cell, when they infect it, less able to be infected by the same virus because they will kill the receptor, for example, of the cell. But this doesn't mean that sometimes there is co-infections, and the co-infections are useful for both viruses. So again, like in any type of life, you get viruses that establish symbiotic relationships, you get viruses that establish competitive relationships, and you get viruses that become not competitive, not symbiotic. It's the same thing as with other types of life. In these terms, viruses are not different from organisms. With a fungi, can be symbiotic or it can be parasitic.
Okay. Adolfo, what's the best way for people to follow up on your particular research and to learn more about what you're doing?
Well, I guess the easiest is to look to my papers, right? But there has a lot of papers, so you can look to my webpage. There is a summary of what we do in the lab, but basically we are people that are interested in understanding virus biology with the idea of how to understand disease caused by viruses, but also to be able to use viruses as tools for therapeutic approaches or for understanding biology. So, we try to develop viruses as agents that will kill cancer. We try to develop viruses as vaccine agents that will be used as vaccines against other virus diseases, and that's taking advantage of what viruses can do to come out with ways how to make them useful by eliminating the pathogenic mechanisms and taking some properties that are useful for us, right? But mainly it's about understanding how viruses interact with the host and how they're able to do what they do, and what we can learn about biology from this interaction.
That's great, Adolfo. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
All right. Very good. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.